politics. I mean, these stories circulate and they help people make calculations of power, right? For example, in the 1730s, 1760s, 1790s, there's a lot of resistance going on, almost in these 30-year cycles. That makes people bolder. If they know there are other mutinies happening, if they know there are urban riots, if they know that there are slave revolts and other kinds of resistance going on, that increases the political will. And so they start to think that things are possible for them too.
Follow the drinking door. Follow the drinking door. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking door. When the sun goes back and the first quail call, follow the drinking door. The old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking door. Follow the drinking door. Follow the drinking door. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking door.
Hello and welcome to The State Between Us. I am your host, Fritz McLinden. My guest today is Marcus Rediker, a scholar whose writings have had a profound effect on the way I look at history of capitalism, the history of rule, and the struggle against it. And those of you who have been with me for a while know that when I was deciding what the first episode of this show would be about, about a year ago, I chose the Manhattan Conspiracy of 1741, which is basically a chapter, from what I have admitted many times to many people, is my favorite book, The Many-Headed Hydra, written some 25 years ago by Marcus and Peter Linebaugh. Patrons of the show will also know that we do our live events and AMAs in a virtual space that I've called Hewson's Tavern, which is named after the tavern that a character, John Hewson, from Many-Headed Hydra, led that very conspiracy. My debt to my guest is, I think, great, and I think listeners will certainly spot the influences that his writings have had on this show. So Marcus Rediker is a chronicler of our history from below, but he also strikes out at the forces and strategies and structures that interrupt our humanity from above. He's a friend to forgotten makers of world historical mischief, like the pirate, the fugitive, the conspirator, the rebel, and the transatlantic proletariat that was born on the decks of transatlantic capitalists and the imperialists of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And while so many critical history texts from the anti-capitalist tradition can sometimes focus a bit myopically on the crushing structures that made our dangerous world, Marcus Rediker returns agency to that story. The characters of his tales remind us that no matter how absolute or eternal the ruling class believes itself to be, they just ain't. They ain't. There's no telling what a person with solidarity, mutual aid, and righteous indignation can accomplish, especially if they get their hands on something maybe a little flammable. I'm speaking, purely historically here, of course. Homeland Security. He is a distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh, with its imposing cathedral of learning, and an award-winning author of many books. Among those my listeners might recognize, apart from the Many-Headed Hydra from the year 2000, include Villains of All Nations from 2004, The Slave Ship, A Human History from 2007, The Amistad Rebellion from 2012, Outlaws of the Atlantic from 2014, and others. Today, Marcus has joined The State Between Us to discuss his 2017 book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker Dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist, and his most recent publication, Freedom Ship, The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. Excerpts from that book you'll be hearing throughout the episode. So, hello, Marcus Rediker, and welcome to The State Between Us.
Thank you, Fritz. I am really happy to join you in Hewson's Tavern.
Yes. Well, I something about it. I've worked in a lot of info shops and anarchist spaces and social centers and stuff like that, and I think Hewson's Tavern to me is just the Maybe not the best model for how to do it moving forward, but certainly a model. It meant a lot to me, for sure. I've read, I think, quite a lot of your books, Marcus. I have to say, I was doing a little inventory here, and I think you're on like a very short list of people of whom I've read 5 of their books. I think it's you. I guess it's David Graeber, Pierre Bourdieu, and I think Marx. So that's the company you're keeping here on the show.
Good company.
Yeah, I think so. So your career has established the centrality of the Atlantic Ocean for understanding the developments of capitalism and modernity. And, I mean, like without the technologies and relations of sea travel, the United States never becomes our problem. It doesn't happen. And in your histories on this theme, I've learned to rethink things like the factory, the strike, things that are very central to kind of coming up as an anti-capitalist of any kind. And one of the concepts, and I think maybe we can start here, is a concept you've taught me called the hydrarchy. And I think that's where I'd like to kick it off, because the hydrarchy, in my reading, was simultaneously the blueprint for the relationships that undergird the modern state and capitalism, but also our means of fighting back against it. I think that in order to appreciate the subjects that we're going to talk about today, it might be worth a brief explanation about what that means, both from the perspective of the position of the master in the hierarchy, but also those that had their own kind of hierarchy from struggling below. So please, Marcus, tell me what is important for my listeners to understand about the hierarchy.
Okay, Fritz, the hierarchy is a concept that, as you mentioned, comes out of the Many-Headed Hydra, the book I wrote with Peter Linebaugh. It's a phrase, a word, actually, that I found reading a text from 1631 in which an author describes sailors as living in a hierarchy.
Uh-huh.
And it turns out it's a very dialectical concept.
Yeah.
Because there is hierarchy from above and there is hierarchy from below. And what we use the from above definition to encompass is essentially the way in which the history of capitalism is very closely bound up with the conquest and the control of the oceans of the world. This is one thing that, Terracentric history always misses.
Yeah.
Capitalism is a maritime phenomenon, the creation of blue water empires, the organization of labor around the Atlantic. These are all very important themes. So hierarchy from above is basically the management over vast maritime spaces of these capitalist-based empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch colonial empire, Spanish, Portuguese, these 5 major Atlantic powers. And of course, the organization of labor is really crucial to all that. How are you going to get the labor from one place to another? How are you going to connect the workers who create the commodities for the world market?
Right.
So that's to look at things from above.
Well, also, sorry to interrupt, but also how to control that labor on the way, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, the organization of labor is, that's a Herculean task, as we say. How do you impose discipline to make these unruly workers cooperate in ways that capitalism requires? But the other side of this thing called hierarchy is that it's the self-organization of maritime workers from below.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean these sailors, and not only sailors, but many other kinds of workers, had ways in which they organized themselves to fight back against this hierarchy from above. They invented things like the strike, as you already mentioned. This is a maritime term. 1768 in London, merchants implemented a wage cut, and sailors responded by going from ship to ship to strike the sails. That means to take down the sails. and commerce comes to a halt, and the accumulation of capital comes to a halt, and the working class has a new kind of power. So this is just one example of the way in which workers on the seas, beside the seas, are kind of at the cutting edge of these new relationships between capital and labor. And it requires a great deal of creativity to come up with ways to resist. But that's what that history from below is all about. It's about resistance.
Would you argue that the hierarchy is how do I phrase this? I guess when I was reading it, it struck me that I was reading about kind of any modern state or modern capitalist kind of relationship. It's just that I was looking at it in a much more embryonic form. Like, what influence do you think that the hierarchy itself had on what we now come to just find as part of a normal experience of capitalism and statecraft?
I think it's more or less continuous in its power from the late 16th century to the present, because the truth is that a very large part of the capitalist economy still functions by sea, as people are now discovering as they think about a place called the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah.
There are maritime terms like choke points that are really crucial to the way world history evolves. So I think this is a fairly universal formulation. And, the simple truth is that without sailors, there could never be a world market.
That's right. Yeah.
Their labor makes this possible. Their labor connects the continents of the world. So if you want a real and true image of the way capitalism operates as a social and economic system, it has to include maritime labor.
And also, you point this out quite often, that pool of labor is a word you like to use, is a motley one, that it comes from everywhere. And by everywhere, I don't necessarily mean the high streets, but rather everywhere in the colonial peripheries. These people get conscripted out of prisons sometimes. Maybe it was used as a kind of spatial fix for poverty at certain points in history. I guess that's also very important, that it's a place where I think class consciousness is also found in its earlier forms, I guess.
Definitely. If you look back at the sailors who manned the ships of Columbus and Magellan, they were from all over the world. They were Italian and Greek and Irish and African. So the truth is the labor market has been international for centuries, and it's still true today to a very large extent. So yeah, this is what we call a motley crew. And this is a phrase that is historically accurate. It comes from the effort to describe a multi-ethnic body of working people. It's used as a slur frequently, as an insult, but I think it actually captures something very important, that people from many different parts of the world are united by their work. They have a job to do, whether it's sailing a ship or unloading cargo from a ship. And the motley crew then becomes a force in the making of history. And this is one of the arguments of the many-headed Hydra.
The solidarity of sailors could take various forms, even on the same freedom voyage, as an unnamed escapee explained to Quaker abolitionist Elizabeth Bootham Chase of Valley Falls, Rhode Island. A black steward had led 2 fugitives aboard his vessel in Portsmouth, Virginia, hiding one in the hold and the other in his own cabin, feeding them at night during the voyage. When the vessel arrived in Wareham, Massachusetts, the captain discovered one of the men vowed to ship him back to slavery and locked him in the cabin. The man broke through the locked door and jumped onto the wharf. The captain, he recalled, called to the men to seize me, but they never moved, and I ran up the street as fast as I could. He escaped. One member of the crew had hidden and fed the men, while the other sailors, who may not have known that the fugitives were on board, disobeyed an order at a crucial moment and thereby facilitated the escape.
Well, we're going to be talking about some of the results of the hierarchy from below today. We're going to be, again, I mentioned it in the introduction, but we'll be looking at your more recent book, Freedom Ship, which includes many stories of moments of solidarity and aid from that motley Atlantic proletariat. But also we'll be talking about Benjamin Lay, who, as we'll discuss in the second part of the episode, developed his worldview working on these ships. And all of that, I think, is very important here. So yeah, for the rest of this episode, I guess we have two parts. So we're gonna start out with Freedom Ship. I'm gonna get some of that sweet structural analysis out of you of our situation here, and then we'll let the very great but very small Benjamin Lay wait till the second half to bring it all down to the human level. So I guess what I'll do is just briefly introduce Freedom Ship to my listeners, and I got some questions for you if you're ready for them.
Ready.
Alrighty. So for my listeners who haven't bought this book yet, please do. But for those who haven't read the book yet, Freedom Ship is a rethinking of the famous Underground Railroad that led America's enslaved people to freedom. And you show through both grander, I'd say political, economic, structural analyses, how that came together. But more importantly, I think through the many, many harrowing stories of just genius, of courage, of direct action from dispossessed people themselves, getting themselves free. And it was in fact the waters of the Atlantic and not necessarily the long road, the long land road, the terracentric land road that ultimately allowed people in bondage to liberate themselves. So in Freedom Ship, you've got several sites that are, I think, of key importance. I would say the ship and the port city both loom very large as spaces where fugitives from slavery can break with the structures that bind them, even turning those structures against themselves in very ingenious and very dangerous ways. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that much like with everything else that has to do with the transatlantic system, the ship and the port city are critical to the rise of industrial capitalism. However, you also pointed out that southern swamplands, which are not at all, I guess, central to the rise of industrial capitalism until you drain them and rationalize them somehow, that these spaces also provided the very different but very effective space for breaking free. So maybe we can break these down. Let's start with the ship, I guess. So I guess my question about the ship is something like, how can it be that, I mean, this is for those who read a lot of Marx, for instance, this probably isn't that much of a shock, but it is always interesting to me that the very thing that turned enslaved people or their parents or their grandparents into commodities was also the very thing that in Freedom Ship decommodifies them and like returns them to life and to being free beings, to no longer being socially dead and stuff like that. So maybe we can start with the ship and how the characters in your book that we're going to be hearing excerpts from throughout the episode, how the ship was structured to sort of allow them to liberate themselves.
The ship, Fritz, as you know, is a technology. It is a machine in a very real way, requiring a complex system of labor to sail it, and thereby to make it the linchpin of this global capitalist economy. And it's crucial to know that the ship is a relatively small space. I mean, there's ships of many different sizes, but it can be a place of autonomy. Mm-hmm. In other words, the sailors can organize themselves to take over a ship, as they would do, for example, after a mutiny, when they would set out as pirates. So the ship has the capacity to be an autonomous space of struggle. And this is actually what happens. In the 18th and 19th century, this global system of trade around the Atlantic evolves, and these trading patterns develop. Now, what's really crucial to the United States in the period of this book, the Freedom Ship, is that in this time period, there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of voyages that are taking place up and down the eastern seacoast of North America.
Right.
Ships from the northern port cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, are making routine and regular voyages to southern ports such as Baltimore, Norfolk, uh, Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia.
Yeah.
And every time one of these vessels arrives in a southern port, it represents a lifeline of escape for enslaved people.
That's interesting, but it's a contradiction too, because the opening of these ports is also how enslaved people get sometimes traded back from the north or up
Exactly.
from the sugar plantation.
No, your opening point that the slave ship was the technology that essentially created the quote slave commodity that imposed a violent commodity form on a human body, creating labor power for the plantation system. That same tall ship can now function as an instrument of liberation. So you're right. The capitalist system depends on these voyages up and down the eastern part of North America. Profits depend on this. The global economy depends on this. But within that lurks this possibility that these sailors whose labor has been organized, cooperative labor has been organized for the sake of capital, can translate that labor into projects of their own.
Yeah.
So for someone wishing to escape slavery in this period, roughly 1830 to 1861, when the Civil War breaks out, they need a strategic connection, one way or another, to someone on the docks or on the ship. This can be a sailor, it can be a dock worker, it can be a market woman. But once this connection is made, what sailors did by the thousands was smuggle enslaved people, freedom seekers, on board their ships and then sail them to a northern port in a state where slavery has been abolished.
Mm-hmm.
And what's remarkable about all this is that despite the fact that we've had, more than a century of sophisticated research on the Underground Railroad, these thousands of people who escaped by sea are almost completely unknown to us.
That's crazy. After reading this book, you just, that's infuriating, actually. We'll cover that a little bit later in the episode.
Yeah.
But
no, it's an important question. How could we not know this?
Yes.
I mean, it's an interesting sociology of knowledge question. So, but anyway, these ships, which were overwhelmingly owned by northern merchants, that's an important part of all this. The northern merchants owned the ships that would go to the south and come back. Like I say, and there are these packet vessels, they're called, that would make the same trip again and again and again, which now enabled the sailors to develop relationships of trust with enslaved people in the southern ports. So that then the time comes where a market woman says, can you take my cousin to New York? And the sailor says, yes, I can. Meet me at such and so time here on the docks, and I'll take that person aboard. So the very operation of the political economy of Atlantic capitalism systematically creates opportunities for people to cooperate subversively for a very different end, which is the expansion of freedom.
And it's worth pointing out, too, that, the way you put it there made it sound like an easy decision. I mean, it is from the moral perspective of humanity, but in fact, there was incredible risk in agreeing to that kind of transfer. We're going to cover a bit about the bureaucratic apparatus that stands between a slave and his freedom, but these sailors risked their jobs, their own freedom, incredible fines to get people out.
This is a tremendously dangerous operation, and it's therefore clandestine. Everything about slavery is legal in this period.
Yeah, right.
So we've got to remember that. So if you are a fugitive seeking to escape, you are putting your life at risk, and these efforts fail, and people frequently pay the price with the flesh off their backs.
Yeah.
But it's also tremendously risky for the sailors and the dock workers and the market women because they run the risk of prison. And quite a number of sailors, black and white, do go to prison for their involvement in this maritime system of escape. So it's a very dangerous system, but the stakes are high.
So, so if you do get through that voyage, you pass the kidnappers and slave catchers. They had a horrible word for this. Was it blackbirding?
Yes, blackbirding. Yeah. It was very common in the northern port cities for ship captains to essentially attack and capture free black workers on the waterfront, take them aboard a ship, and then sail them to the south to sell them into slavery. In some cases, to sell people back into slavery that they had escaped once earlier, and now they go back. So there's literally a war on the waterfront between the forces of slavery and the forces of freedom.
So they get to the waterfront finally. They arrive in New York, Baltimore, Philly, hopefully, or if their luck is quite bad, they end up in fucking Charleston, etc. But the city is the other main site of this book where practices of solidarity, mutual aid, and liberation happen. What is it about the city, the kind of the fresh industrializing American city, as opposed to, say, like an inland village or something like that? What is it about the city that gave people their chance at freedom?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that the cities are not all identical. And it's important to know why. For example, it was more dangerous to sail to New York than it was to sail either to Philadelphia or Boston.
Boston, I forgot to mention. Yeah, really important one for this story. Yeah.
And the reason why is that a huge amount of the cotton that was shipped out of the South in the 19th century was transshipped by northern merchants in New York. Mm-hmm. So these northern merchants in New York are in very close relationships with southern cotton planters. So every time someone escapes a ship in New York, these northern merchants want to send that person back immediately. So everyone who arrives in New York, it's very, very dangerous. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The abolitionist movement is stronger in both Philadelphia and especially Boston, which means that your chances there are probably better. And it's fascinating to know that a lot of enslaved people in the South understood this. They knew that Boston was their best hope. Mm-hmm. And so they would try to find a Boston ship. One ship captain says, it's amazing how the enslaved people who came aboard to unload the ships, how quickly they could figure out where a ship was from. Mm. So there's like this imagined geography of freedom that is in the minds of the people who are seeking to escape. So that's all very important. But the city itself offers a lot of work. In other words, if you get off a ship in Boston, you can find work on the waterfront. In Philadelphia, the same thing. So that, and they're also it's important to know, there are free black communities in all of these northern port cities, mm-hmm. built to some extent by people who had also escaped by sea a little bit earlier. So this becomes a very important place for escapees because the free black communities will shelter people, give them clothing, give them food. And then alongside that, in the 1830s, a new and more radical kind of abolitionist organization called the Vigilance Committee is organized first in New York, then in Philadelphia, then in Boston. And one of their primary goals as an abolitionist organization is to provide mutual aid for people who are trying to escape slavery. So these are the resources that would be waiting for fugitives when they got to one of the northern port cities.
It also was interesting in your book that you mentioned the kind of tensions between these northern and southern cities. It seems like there's a kind of a control that each exerts over the other in a way that neither are entirely comfortable with. You mentioned that, for instance, the South was dependent on the North's access to markets. And so there was a feeling that maybe they were getting a bit screwed over, I guess, by Northern power. But then in the North, there was a cowardice around these fugitive slave laws, that one of the characters in your book was chastising his kind of Northern compatriots for letting Southern cities dictate their policies. Maybe you can talk a little about that.
Well, the Southern ruling class is in a pretty desperate situation because they need these Northern ships and Northern sailors and Northern merchants in order to prosper economically. They depend on this shipping system. So consequently, they've got a tremendous dilemma. They need black labor to work on the ships, to unload the ships. And they try to do everything they can to limit the cooperation, especially between black Northern sailors and black Southern workers, usually enslaved people. They developed something called the Negro Seaman Act. And this was basically an act in which when a ship sailed into a Southern harbor, the black sailors would be taken off the ship and literally placed in quarantine to prevent their cooperation with the people on the waterfront, and then would be allowed to come back on board the ship 24 hours before the ship would set sail. And what that meant two things. One is that white sailors would frequently take the place of the black sailors in helping fugitives on board. And secondly, a lot of fugitives knew to come to the ship within the 24 hours before it took off, because the black sailors would be back aboard. So you mentioned the word earlier that there is a kind of genius of resistance. And I think it's one of the really powerful things I learned in doing the research for this book is the ingenious ways people figured out how to make this system of maritime escape work.
It says a lot, too, about the kind of pathways of communication that get opened when you start moving people around everywhere, especially, when you start shipping people as items. Even you're also shipping the lessons that they've learned. If you mentioned this, I think going back to the many-headed Hydra, even that escaped slaves might find themselves captured and then sold back into slavery to an unsuspecting buyer who might not know, their history. And that would simply lead to, more knowledge about how to escape, how to rebel, how to fight back, how to maybe even kill your master. That this network of communication is also developing at the same time, completely out of control of the ruling class.
It can't be controlled. That's the thing. You need these workers, and these workers are vectors of information. International vectors of information, of knowledge, of subversive knowledge, so that Julia Scott has written this wonderful book called The Common Wind about how mobile workers, especially sailors, spread the news of the Haitian Revolution during the 1790s.
Right.
And the same thing is going on here. Black sailors would come back to the North and they would tell people working in the abolitionist movement what the situation was in these southern ports and how people could get free and what kind of resistance was going on there. So seafaring storytelling becomes one of the most important ways that information is conveyed over vast maritime spaces.
It makes sense that you put it that way. I've been thinking about your work from the perspective of a storyteller and about what storytelling means also to me, as I'm building this show and stuff. And I think that's definitely part of the answer there, that stories are not just stories. They're also instructions. They're lessons.
It's true. Walter Benjamin wrote a wonderful essay called The Storyteller, in which he argues that historically, there are two basic kinds of storytellers. There is the peasant storyteller with a tremendous knowledge of rich local lore and history. And then there's the seafaring storyteller who brings stories from far away. And I think this is really valuable for understanding, because the truth is that liberation movements can't operate without communication.
Yeah.
Without the knowledge of history, without knowing For example, what are your prospects? I mean, these stories circulate and they help people make calculations of power, right? For example, in the 1730s, 1760s, 1790s, there's a lot of resistance going on, almost in these 30-year cycles. That makes people bolder. If they know there are other mutinies happening, if they know there are urban riots, if they know that there are slave revolts and other kinds of resistance going on, that increases the political will. And so they start to think that things are possible for them too. I think this is a very important part of resistance that we don't usually understand, that there are ways in which the news of resistance circulates, and this does have a quite incendiary effect.
Well, that especially works for, the ports, the ships, etc. But you also mention maybe as a tertiary site, the swamp. And this is not a space necessarily that's well connected into this system. It's not going to have those same quick lines of communication. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm wrong there, but the swamp to me seems like it's a crazy space. It's a space of exile. It's a strange place where human life is very hard, but plant and animal life thrive in kind of a wild and chaotic state. So maybe you can explain also how the swamp plays into these stories of liberation. I mean, did 19th century modernity just kind of bottom out there? Or did they offer like more of a temporary solution, or were they more for long-term prospects? What's the deal there?
Well, the Great Dismal Swamp, which was originally a massive swampland encompassing large parts of Virginia and North Carolina, was a place to which fugitives would abscond. And sometimes they would do it simply to bide time, to let the search for themselves die down, and then to make some sort of a connection to get on board a ship. But there is an interesting comparison here, because these swamplands are essentially autonomous zones, right? Like the lower deck of a ship can be that under certain circumstances, but this is the place where the normal power of society does not operate. It's also, these swamplands are kind of a commons, right? And one of the things that's going to happen to the Great Dismal Swamp over time is that it's going to be essentially turned into arable farmland around the edges. Big landowners are going to gain control of it. Companies are formed to try to mine its resources. So there's a kind of struggle for the commons going on. And what's also important in this context is that if you are a fugitive who wants to live in the swamp for a period of time, you need to know how to live on its resources.
Yeah.
So you need the knowledge of commoning. This is something that Peter Linebaugh has written about.
Right.
So it's interesting to see these different autonomous zones in relation to each other. Some of them are just temporary, right? Like the ship. But the way in which these spaces of freedom can be linked to each other is really crucial.
Sarah Moore escaped bondage in New Bern, North Carolina in 1843, concealed by a ship's steward in a, quote, unoccupied stateroom forward of ye cabin, unquote, a place used for the ship's stores such as tools, oakum, tar, cordage, canvas sails, and other, quote, articles of daily necessity. The steward helped Moore cover herself with these items and lie still to avoid being found out by the ship's mate, who routinely visited the room, lantern in hand, to pick up this or that. Moore explained to abolitionist Sidney Howard Gay that the mate, quote, never discovered her, so well was she concealed in a place only partially lighted, and so quiet did she keep herself. Moore never left the cabin and spent the entire 7-day voyage disguised by the materials of maritime labor. She arrived safely in New York.
And I guess on the wider subject of the limits of the fantasies of control, I guess, that the ruling class would like to have had, or would continue to like to have over us. I'm specifically talking, I guess, about the Southern plantation class, but not just. Maybe you can talk to us about how the ruling class tried, but also ultimately in many ways failed to control specifically Black bodies in these kinds of spaces. I mean, reading these texts, I'm blown away by I guess complexity is a nice word for it. call it fucking chaos, but the papers, the permissions, the kind of novel institutions they build, pseudo-psychological studies, just the sheer kind of developing bureaucratic apparatus that grew up around this moment as they tried to retain even the fiction of control over people who sought their freedom on the ships and the docks, etc.
There's a great irony here, and that is that historians have really not been aware of the magnitude of this resistance as people escaped by sea. But I assure you, members of the Southern ruling class were extremely aware of it.
Yeah. I mean, they were counting the money. You know what I mean? Like
they were watching their so-called property slip away. And so they are very, very conscious of it, and they do everything they can to try to stop it. They develop pass systems. You can't go on board a ship without a pass. A ship can't come into a certain part of the Chesapeake without permission. They develop inspection systems whereby every outward bound ship to a northern port has got to be searched. And even within the searches, they did very novel and strange things, like, for example, what was called vessel fumigation. They would take sulfur, set it on fire inside a barrel on the lower deck of the ship, and let the extreme fumes of the sulfur try to smoke out the fugitives who were hiding.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah. So, and so that's another thing that they did. They tried everything, and none of it worked. None of it worked. It's just fascinating to see. Look, you say I need a pass? Okay, there's a literate enslaved person a mile down the road who can write me a pass.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this traffic in illegal or forged passes becomes something very important. You try to regulate which enslaved workers can go on board a ship, but of course the captain needs people. And the slave owner needs people. They need people to do this labor. So sometimes they look the other way. Somebody doesn't have a pass. They're not supposed to be on. People develop really clever ways to avoid the fumigation. Some people would use like fish skin to create masks so they could continue to breathe.
Oh, wow.
As the smoke is being suffused. So my point is that and some of these systems are very expensive. I mean, if you're going to try to inspect thousands of ships in Chesapeake Bay, it's going to cost a lot of money. You've got to create a whole army of pilots to sort of search these ships.
Which you would think defeats the whole point of that apparatus. The point is to save your quote unquote property, or save the money, or keep it flowing at least in the market. But here they are just dumping cash into wacky systems that barely work. Is this? I mean, so I guess it kind of betrays like the limits of a purely kind of materialist analysis, or maybe I'm overstating it, but it seems to me that it speaks a lot to that will to control, the pride that comes with being the ruling class.
Well, I think these Southern rulers thought, I mean, it's actually a comment on the magnitude of maritime escape, that we're willing to spend all this money because the people who are running away are costing us even more money.
Right. And in enormous numbers too. I mean, yeah.
But the truth is, as you say, the political will of people to be free is greater than all of the money and schemes and everything these rulers can do to try to control their mobility. Because mobility is necessary for the economic system to operate.
Yeah.
So it just can't really be controlled. So this is one of the fascinating things about this, that in some ways, the normal operation of capitalism created openings for people. There were ways in which people could exploit that system for their own purposes.
I think there's something about, I guess, the shapelessness of life that you start to feel when you read these stories, that you put down a wall, but someone's going to just slip through a crack in it anyway, Yeah.
No, I think that's true. And one of the things that does come across in the book is the hundreds of different ways that people figured out how to escape. Some people did it through disguise. It's fascinating. You find people who are dressing. I found an enslaved man dressing as a woman.
Right.
I found people trying to pass for white. One person dresses up as a white gentleman. So that one person pretends to be a free person of color, and he's got a very expensive watch,
Loved
which
that story.
is
Yeah.
a symbol of his freedom. So they're just, see, this is something I want to get across in the book. These working people are thinkers. They're not just brute beasts who do the labor and produce, the profits. They are people who have very complex thoughts about slavery and freedom, and they devise these ingenious ways to escape again and again and again.
Yeah, it's true. It's both encouraging but also terrifying because you when I finish one of these stories, especially the ones that result in liberation, you feel that rush of like vindication, sort of, even through their eyes, I suppose. Like you it's so clear who the bad guy is in these stories, and it's great to see them fail. But then I put down the book, and I see the latest headline of the newest ICE shooting, or the war expanding, or new restrictions on movement in Europe, and all of that is kind of here in its nascent form too. How much of this just stayed around, just became the way we move? How much of this prefigures things like the passport, and I mean, I guess the passport is really my concern, but yeah, please.
Yeah, the desire to control the movement of human bodies is absolutely central to capitalism, and it always has been. The big difference now is that states are much more powerful. There are all kinds of new technologies, but the struggles go on. I'm actually part of a group of people who have produced essays on solidarity at sea. We did a conference in Amsterdam in 2018 where we brought together historians who work on maritime solidarity with activists and no border activists who work on contemporary issues of solidarity in order to figure out what has changed and what hasn't. My contribution to this volume is a reflection on what abolitionists, black and white, patrician and proletarian, did to facilitate escape. And so I came up with a set of suggestions about lessons that these 19th century struggles can teach people in the past about, for example, documenting the conditions of life that people are trying to escape, amplifying the voices of the fugitives themselves, letting them tell their own stories. So there are tremendous continuities in these forms of oppression, but there are also continuities in the forms of resistance.
Was this this is one of the books of yours I haven't read, or I guess that you contributed to, but I don't know much about it. But is this the Global History of Runaways text?
That is actually a book that came out of a different conference. We've been organizing meetings, University of Pittsburgh History Department and the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. And we've done a whole series of conferences. One of them was a global history of runaways. Another one was solidarity at sea. And then most recently, we have put together a collection of essays on the many-headed Hydra 25 years later. So, but all these are about history from below and in a kind of transnational way.
Great. And let's get to the heart of the historical blindness here before we move on to Benjamin. Why is it, do you think, that these nautical dimensions of what we call the Underground Railroad that brought people to freedom has been so downplayed or understated or forgotten in our common understanding of history? I mean, I'm reading in Freedom Ship, for example, I think almost anybody who grew up in the States, I would hope, knows at least a little bit about Frederick Douglass, but you don't really learn that he also came from this kind of Atlantic scene. And why is it? In my mind, maybe it is almost kind of too complex for the easy mythologies that America used to kind of oversimplify this piece of history and just kind of move on from it? I mean, please tell us, what do you think? Why has this been?
Well, I
this
think
element been forgotten?
oversimplification is part of it. I mean, for a long time in the early days, the scholarship about the Underground Railroad was meant to make white people feel better
Sure.
about slavery and the Civil War, and to show that some of them actually took part in this abolitionist movement. So that was one purpose. But basically, I think there are three different things that operate to disguise our knowledge of this vast system of maritime escape. One is the very phrase Underground Railroad. It's misleading. I mean, it's really just a metaphor. And what metaphors do is that they organize our understanding and occlude certain other understandings. So, for example, Underground Railroad. Well, I'm sorry to have to tell you, hardly anybody escaped underground, and a few people escaped on railroads, but this is really a profoundly misleading metaphor. Okay, that's one thing. So a second thing is the images of escaping slavery in popular culture.
Right.
You've no doubt seen the image of a single man, sometimes a woman, with a bindle and a staff, walking on land toward freedom. Well, this image comes from the advertisements that enslavers would place in newspapers to draw the eye of a reader to a runaway. Describing that person. But this also gives the wrong impression. First of all, it makes you think that running away is a solitary endeavor.
Right.
And almost never was it solitary. You needed help. And the more help you had, the more likely you were to be successful. So this is misleading. But the third thing, and the biggest thing, I think, is that, for years, Fritz, I was trying to figure out why people could not see maritime history, why they couldn't see the oceans of the world as historical spaces. And I finally, after many years of thinking about this, invented a word that described a bias in our modern thought, and that is, I call that bias terracentrism.
Yeah.
By which I mean simply land-based history. We assume that history happens on land in nation states. But the truth is that a lot of history happens at sea. The history of class formation, the history of race formation, the history of culture formation, and especially the struggle at sea against slavery. People fight against slavery at sea, on slave ships and on these freedom ships. But the way in which we think history actually happens prevents us from seeing that. So I think this is kind of one of the things that I've been up against in trying to write about struggles at sea my entire career, that if you think history happens on land, you somehow think that the oceans of the world are ahistorical voids. And that's just simply not true.
I think it also directly challenges national mythology as a concept, because national mythology wants these borders, and these borders for sure end at the coastline, Yeah. Anything that happens outside of that, I mean, maybe it happened, but it's not our problem because, we've got our heroes, we've got our borders, and we've got our little confined story. And I think the minute that you begin to recognize that these nations sit precariously atop a global system of exchange and lessons and stories and power, that falls apart very quickly.
That's a very important point you've made. When I was first doing this kind of research on sailors, people would ask me, "What are you studying?" I'd say I'm studying sailors, transatlantic sailors, and they would say, "Oh, those marginal people." and I would bristle. I'd say, "Marginal to what?"
Yeah,
they're certainly not marginal to the growth of international capitalism. But what they were referring to was they're marginal to national histories.
Yes.
And you're right, the landed part of that history and the heroes, there just wasn't room for it. But the truth is that the old national stories are not making much sense anymore.
We'll know.
And so with the rise of Atlantic history and oceanic history and world history, we really have a very different view of how things happen and why.
I think maybe also it's got something to do with who built our institutions of learning, and the powers that lie behind those institutions often come from landed power. People that got their money because they have a lot of it. And you got to assume that some of that turns into a long historical bias,
Oh, definitely. There's a phrase for this, that the winners write the history.
Well, there you go.
But then, with the emergence of the social movements of the 60s and 70s, a lot of people like me became historians and, in other fields too, with a commitment to telling a different kind of history.
Yeah.
We forget that it's movements who demand new kinds of histories. The civil rights movement and the Black Power movement wanted a history that took race and slavery more seriously. The people fighting against the war in Vietnam wanted a different history of American power in the world, a new history of imperialism. And of course, one of the biggest challenges of all came from the women's historians who said, you haven't even included the larger half of humanity and all this. So these movements generate the impulses to writing new kinds of history. And that's really, I think, this is where things have changed. My next book is going to be a history of history from below.
Oh, great.
Of how it is that we came to have these kinds of histories that concentrate on ordinary working people, men, women, motley crews. How did we get to that point where we can imagine a different set of subjects of history, but also different makers of history? Because that's a big part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that.
James Noble of Baltimore had a pretty good idea about what had happened, even though he had been powerless to stop it. He claimed a young woman named Lear Green as his property. She was, quote, about 18 years of age, black complexion, round-featured, good-looking, and ordinary size. She was likely a, quote, fancy girl, someone forced into prostitution and repeated rape. The clue lay in her stylish silken clothes, bonnet, dress, and cape. This was not how most enslaved people dressed. Noble also knew that Green's boyfriend, the quick-spoken, scar-faced William Adams, and his mother, both free people of color, were likely involved in the escape. Adams, quote, had been heard to say that he was going to marry Green and take her to New York by ship. Baltimore was known for a rigorous train and ship inspection system designed to prevent escape from bondage, so it took special headwork and planning to beat it. Green, Adams, and his mother designed a plan, the centerpiece of which was a seaman's chest, the rough wooden box in which mariners carried everything they needed for a long sea voyage. Inside the chest, the plotters placed a quilt, a pillow, a few articles of clothing, quote, a small quantity of food, and a bottle of water, end quote, and finally Green herself. The sea chest would be her vessel within the vessel. Adams and his mother then fastened strong ropes around the box and placed it as freight aboard one of the overnight steamships of the Erickson Line, which ran regularly from Baltimore to Philadelphia. Adams' mother would accompany the chest on the voyage, knowing that the racist policy of the shipping company required that all people of color remain on deck, which was exactly where she wanted to be, near the chest that carried Green. Even so, she fretted terribly and wanted to open the wooden box to provide fresh air and even, quote, to see if the poor child still lived. 18 hours later, the steamer arrived at the wharf in Philadelphia, where all freight was unloaded, including the box with the stowaway hidden inside. Green and Adam had arranged to have the chest delivered to friends of his mother on Barley Street, where her relieved and joyful liberation took place. Acting on behalf of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, William Still took the young woman into his own home for several days to protect her and to help her recover her health. Green explained to her benefactor that through it all, she, quote, had no fear.
Well, let's switch gears here from the sort of larger structural questions and talk about your buddy Benjamin Lay. The title of your book on him from 2017 kind of sums up the story pretty well on its own, which, just to read out again to the listeners, is the fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist, which, as I understand it, these days not only has a graphic novel based on that story, as does, I think, Houston's Tavern, right? Or rather the
That's right.
Yeah, 1741 Conspiracy. But also Benjamin Lay has a play that you co-produced about him too, which is very cool. I wish I could see it, but I'm very far away. Across the Atlantic, no less, Marcus. You see, we're reliving that very line of communication at this moment.
That's right.
So I have to say, though, I did finish this book with a bit of an internal struggle because I'm bitterly suspicious about and I know that you agree with this, about the great man approach to history. You know, it's like a stepping stone to authoritarianism. It's not really history, it's hagiography. But I honestly, I could not stop myself from feeling that you'd somehow uncovered an actual great man of world history here. And the obvious irony of that, of course, is that he's a little guy. You know, so I don't know. Maybe first I might want to press you on that a little bit. He's a great man, but he's a great man from below. And I don't know. Is that a tension for you at all, or is that just my problem?
No, it is. Let me first say that I was very interested in writing about Benjamin Lay because I wanted to write a history of a working class intellectual. This is something that people still have a lot of trouble with, the idea that there are working people who really think in the world. And it turns out that Benjamin Lay is very important. So what I wanted to do was to write a book about an individual, but to anchor him in a different set of working experiences, which made it possible to think about him in a new way, and to think also about the history of abolitionism in a new way from below. So, several of my recent books have been about abolitionism from below. Freedom Ship is about that. The Amistad Rebellion is about that. The Benjamin Lay book is about that. We have this received wisdom that the anti-slavery movement was the gift from enlightened men,
yes,
middle class, upper class, people like William Wilberforce, and this gift to benighted humanity. And of course, the more we study this, the more we see that that's just completely false.
Yes.
So to in a sense bring back into the story the resistance from below. I've taken many different tacks with this. We had the successful revolt aboard the Amistad. We've had the system of maritime escape, which, by the way, is built almost entirely on the initiative of the fugitives.
Yeah,
along with their working class allies. I mean, these other abolitionists, the sort of elite abolitionists, don't get involved until the very end of the story, if they get involved at all. Many escapees go straight to the free black community and then just disappear.
Hell yeah.
So anyway, there's a larger effort to rethink big subjects in history from below. And I thought that Benjamin Lay was a very good way to do this. Now, I first encountered him back when Peter Linebaugh and I were writing The Many-Headed Hydra. But having studied him at that time, I realized that he deserved his own book. And, I wrote several other books, but came back around to him because I wanted the example of someone who broke through the common sense of his day to arrive at a conclusion that almost nobody else had reached.
Yes.
That was that slavery had to be abolished immediately.
Yes.
Benjamin Lay is saying this 100 years before William Lloyd Garrison becomes famous for immediatism, as they call it. Immediate abolition, not gradual abolition. Benjamin Lay was here more than 100 years before. So one of the key questions of this book is, how was he able to do that? What was it about this man who had very few educational opportunities, came from a humble farming family in Britain, in the region of Essex, a little village called Copford, worked as a common sailor, just an ordinary common sailor for 10 or 12 years. How did he make this breakthrough? So I felt like there was something really valuable in writing a kind of biography from below and an intellectual history from below that would be combined with that.
Well, let me just give the listener a very, very brief kind of biographical summary of Benjamin Lay, and then, feel free to add into it as you see fit. But Benjamin Lay was a Quaker born in 1682, as you said, in Essex area, right? Or in some village outside, and died in 1759 in Pennsylvania. He spent most of that time in I'd say from my reading, a lonely but furious opposition, as you said, to the institution of slavery, but not just other institutions and norms as well that we still, let's say, have yet to overcome, such as sexism, racism, and the general idea that the world is just one big resource for humanity to exploit, and he found himself an outcast from the society of friends with whom he identified. For a while, he was, in my reading, I think an important part of his, I guess we can call it radicalization, was his experiences in the just unbelievably gory sugar trade in the Americas, as well as you've pointed out, through his life as a seaman on the Atlantic. And he was very legitimately an organic intellectual that put the ruling class scholars of his day to shame on most of these subjects. He was a vegetarian. He lived a humble life, and he was just a very interesting and very dramatic guy. And I very much recommend readers check out this book. It's a I'd call it an easy read, a fun read. And it includes some pretty good ideas, maybe, for people who also like to make some dramatic displays of their own direct actions and protests. Ben had a style to him. He had a style. So I guess, that is the question. You already kind of preempted it yourself there, but, the combination of life experiences that he had are definitely his. They make him, but none of them are entirely unique to him. So that is the question. What is it about him? What about him allowed him to see the completely normal institution of slavery as the social murder that it was, like a century before Friedrich Engels was talking in those terms? Like, what do you think he in particular, why was it him in particular that needed to save the world from itself, while other people are out there focusing on saving themselves from the world or building up power in that very world?
Mm-hmm. I think it was the combination of working experiences and the conclusions that he drew from them. Benjamin Lay, and the other thing we should mention, which is quite an important part of the story, is that he had dwarfism.
Right.
He was about 4 feet tall, and this caused him a lot of pain and ridicule. One of the things that he did was fight very hard for his ideas, but he was constantly being subjected to insults and the like. But he was not an easy man to ignore, and he had tremendous confidence in his radical ideas. So basically, Benjamin was the heir to radical Quakerism. In other words, Quakers have got a long history, but the founding generation during the English Revolution were particularly militant and very, very radical. And Benjamin, growing up in an area where radical Quakerism had kind of a stronghold, embodied these ideas. And one of the main things about all this is that he was an antinomian radical.
Yes.
And by that I mean that he was someone who believed that the individual conscience was much more important than the laws that rich men had made for their own protection.
Yeah.
And that indeed a properly godly person would reject those wicked laws and refuse to obey them. So this becomes a very potent resource of resistance. When you combine that with other experiences Benjamin had, especially his 10 to 12 years at sea, where he learned the necessity of solidarity. Sailoring was a very dangerous job. Sailors depended on each other for their lives. And so Benjamin imbibed this ethic of solidarity. He also became very cosmopolitan in the way that sailors were. But then he made a very interesting leap, because in 1718, he and his wife Sarah, who was also a little person, moved to Barbados, which is one of the leading slave societies in the world.
Yeah.
And Benjamin saw up close, firsthand, the extreme violence of slavery. Now, there were lots of other Quakers in Barbados, but they basically, all of them made peace with it. He refused to make peace with it. He was wounded, you might say, by the extreme violence he saw and which happened to people that he knew and liked. He had friends on the waterfront. He and Sarah began to feed the hungry, as many enslaved people were. And they, hundreds of people would show up at their home on a Sunday. And he began speaking out against slavery at this time. And of course, this infuriated the sugar planters who wanted to drive him off the island. So if you put these things together, sort of radical Quakerism, the seafaring, the experience and resistance of enslaved people in Barbados, all that adds up to a breakthrough. And I think this is really important to understand. And he had, it's significant to know, he had a worldview that was radically integrated. In other words, he wasn't just an abolitionist. He believed in gender equality.
Right.
He believed in class equality. He believed in protecting the environment. He was a champion of animal rights. All of these radical practices he made part of his own life. He lived that life. There's an old Quaker saying, let your life speak.
Mm.
And Gandhi sort of said the same thing, be the change in the world that you want to see.
Right.
Well, Benjamin Lay did this, and he lived a kind of exemplary life. But it was the combination of experiences, I think, that allowed him to make the breakthrough.
And he could make his case in the language of his opposition as well. Like he, despite not having like a classical education, he ended up getting himself one, right? He was a great reader. He died with a lot of books around him, and he communicated through the language of revelation, of end times, I guess, apocalypse, prophecy, that kind of thing. At least in one very standout example, his text. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the title of something like Slavery Apostate. Please help me with the title of that.
The title of the book is All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage Apostates. In other words, Christianity and slave keeping are incompatible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's that's very interesting, especially from a guy writing in the time he was. And that's very interesting today as well, because the language that he uses at this point, I'm talking about the language of revelations of end times, etc., of judgment, of holy judgment, that these are relatively squarely in the wheelhouse of the militant right wing in the US today. And I talk quite a lot on this show about the very wacky, but ultimately quite dangerous kind of woo-woo that brought us things like Christian identity, Nazi types, evangelical Zionists through the pathways of British Israelism, which has its own idea of Zion. I bring up Zion because that's an important reference point for Benjamin Lay. I think about, So I guess my question is, what did things like prophecy, revelation, Zion, these religious concepts mean to Benjamin Lay? And how can we think about this as being fundamentally in opposition to the sort of various quote unquote Zionisms of today, or these sorts of, I guess, classically WASP originated ideas about religion that grew out of 19th century Anglicanism, et cetera, in the US? How does Benjamin Lay kind of use these concepts differently?
Well, I think of it this way. Inside every faith community, there's usually a struggle.
Sure.
And inside Christianity, one of the great struggles historically has been the development of liberation theology.
Yeah.
A left-wing reading of the Bible that is aligned with usually peasant-based communities and is essentially designed to accompany those people in their struggles. So one way to think about Benjamin Lay is that he was a liberation theologian before his time.
Way before his time.
Right. I mean, he read the book of Revelation as an anti-slavery interpretation, a very creative interpretation. Um, so that he basically rehearsed all these biblical arguments against slavery. He said, you can't do it, and he knew the Bible inside out. It's extraordinary. I'm very interested in this in particular at this moment because I am working on a critical and scholarly edition of Benjamin Lay's book, All Slave Keepers Apostates. And I've been going over this. I'm working with a divinity scholar at Cambridge University named Justin Meggitt, and we're literally going over Lay's book line by line. And we're very interested in the way in which he sees himself as a prophet, like Isaiah or
Right.
Jeremiah or Ezekiel, um, and that he really does believe that only by abolishing slavery can you save not only the Quaker faith, but save society itself. He actually makes a prophetic judgment. He says to his readers, now this is in 1738, he said, if you don't get the poison of slavery out of the body politic, it's going to damage you and your society for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And he was completely right about that. But I also want to just dissent a little bit from your early comment about him living a lonely life. Now, it's true that Benjamin, in presenting himself as a prophet, would frequently suggest that he was a lone voice crying in the wilderness.
Sure.
That's what prophets do. But the truth is, he was building an anti-slavery movement in his own day among the poorer Quakers who weren't enslavers, and he was actually building a force that would eventually be successful in making the Quakers become the first group to abolish slavery in their own midst.
That's true.
And here's just an example of the way scholarship is never finally finished. Benjamin performed this dramatic act of guerrilla theater, which you alluded to earlier, in which he went to a Philadelphia yearly meeting where all of the weighty Quakers, as they're called, would be present. He dressed in a military uniform at a time when Quakers, were already committed to the peace principle. He buckled a sword at his waist. He took a book and cut out a secret compartment, filled an animal bladder with blood,
Yes.
put it inside the book, threw an overcoat over his shoulders, and then went into this meeting because he's going to speak from the Spirit. And Quakers, don't have a single minister. So he waited his turn. He stood up. He threw off the overcoat. People saw the sword and the uniform, and they gasped. And then he says, God will take vengeance against those who oppress their fellow creatures. And he raised the book above his hand, and he thrust the sword through the book, and the fake blood came gushing out, and he sprinkles it on the head of the enslavers who were sitting nearby.
That's so cool.
Total pandemonium breaks out. And he's just standing there holding the book with the dripping blood, and they throw him out. So this is like a moment of truth where he says, look, this violence that you use in holding people in slavery, it's going to come back to you in one way or another. Okay, so here's the thing about the scholarship. About a year ago, I got a message out of the blue from a young divinity scholar who had found a document that had never been seen by modern historians, found it in the Moravian archives, the papers of Bishop Augustus Spangenberg,
Okay.
and it was an eyewitness account of Benjamin Lay stabbing the bladder of blood.
Nice.
And it was written by someone who agreed with Benjamin about the evil of slavery. And what's really fascinating, and there are 4 other accounts of this event, 2 of them written by Benjamin's arch enemies and 2 by people who were somewhat more neutral. But this person described a very different event. When Benjamin left the meeting house, a portion of the congregation got up and went with him.
Nice. Okay.
So he had a following. He was part of a movement. He was building power from below to make the abolition of slavery real.
I guess when I said lonely, I was probably thinking of his struggles with the organizations of the Society of Friends that would, for instance, not legalize his marriage, recognize rather, that would push him out and stuff like that. But yeah, it's true. In a way, it was them that ultimately started to feel a bit lonelier and lonelier. And it was Ben that kind of came out surrounded by friends.
It's true that he was disowned by these 4 different meetings, but there's an interesting wrinkle to this. When Quakers disowned someone, what that meant was they could not take part in the meetings that decided policy.
Uh-huh.
But they did not ban people from worship. So Benjamin would continue to attend all these meetings and continue to draw this line saying, are you for slavery or are you against it? So, but this idea that he lived in a cave and people thought he was kind of like this hermit, but he wasn't a hermit. He was out there in society arguing for his causes all the time. And he just wouldn't take no for an answer.
Okay. All right. I'm reminded of, I wrote down a quote actually from the other book we talked about, from Freedom Ship. You have a chapter describing a man named Jonathan Walker. And at one point he's not in a church, but rather addressing workers. And he says, I have it here, "You, my working friends," he explained, "must understand that the chain which you have been helping to secure on the limbs of the southern chatteled slaves has its other end fastened upon your own." I feel a continuity here, sort of with the story of the Bloody Bible, in a way that...
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely, because Benjamin Lay did believe that only when a real movement came up to demand an end to bondage would it ever finally happen. And Benjamin Lay was also one of the first people to emphasize that even people who just tacitly support slavery or don't oppose it are complicit. You might say he's like the first person who understood this idea of being complicit with slavery. And this is why he refused to consume any commodity made with slave labor. He wouldn't eat sugar. He wouldn't smoke tobacco because he believed, or he understood rather, that by taking part in the commerce, in the purchase of products produced by slave labor, you were actually supporting that institution. This is something that Marx talked about 125 years later.
Right.
In what he wrote about the commodity, the way the commodity hides the human labor behind it.
Right.
Benjamin Lay understood that much, much earlier. So this is, you've got to, it's about the politics of consumption. He had the idea that the thing that now animates people in the fight against sweatshops.
Right.
He understood that idea, 300 years ago. So anyway, there is a strong continuity in many of these radical ideas, and I think this is one part of the power of history from below, that people recognize that things that they care about, things that they're fighting for, that others have been fighting for a very long time, and this can make you feel connected to a tradition of struggle.
We mentioned sugar a couple times. Maybe you could just share a couple words with the listeners about what it was about sugar that really shocked Benjamin Lay. It shocked me as well, actually.
That can be summed up pretty quickly, because Benjamin Lay believed, and abolitionists later on will all say, sugar is made with blood.
Literally, though.
Literally. I mean, he saw the sugar vats. He walked through the dark satanic sugar mill. He saw the vats of boiling sugar. He saw body parts of the enslaved that were mixed into these vats of sugar. He saw the bodies that spent their vital forces, people literally being worked to death in order to make this lucrative commodity called sugar. And so he tried to get people to understand that when you sip a cup of tea, you're actually exploiting sugar workers in the Caribbean and tea workers in India and China.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be conscious of what you're consuming. So he understood all this. And this is just another way in which he was so extraordinarily far ahead of his time.
Do you think it's fair to say that he had like a relational sense of what class meant as a dynamic, as opposed to just maybe economic status? That he saw it as a way that we relate to each other?
Definitely. And what he saw, he actually had a whole critique of property
Right.
as something that mediated human beings' relationships with each other.
Amazing. I can't, it's so hard to get my head around.
No. He said, he actually asked in his book, he says, property, this is all the furniture of the devil. This is what prevents us from living the right way. So he had a very clear understanding of how the market damaged society, how slavery damaged society. He really had a very radical vision. And this is why I call him the first revolutionary abolitionist. He wanted a whole different way of life without the exploitation of human beings and without the exploitation of other animals. This is another important thing about him. He believed that as long as human beings kill animals, they will keep killing each other.
I love him. Like straight up. I love this man. I guess that leads to probably my last question of the day. And that is going to be about Benjamin Lay, his sort of very radical and revolutionary take on slavery in particular, and how that contrasted against what I think you referred to as the, quote, gentlemen saints, these types who attacked slavery from above. I mean, I guess to give some context, we did an episode on this show that covered some of the, the darker side, I guess, of the American ruling class abolition movement, some of their very bizarre ideas about race that certainly would surprise a lot of people, I would say, and kind of their motivations. I mean, Pinkerton, you're in Pittsburgh. Pinkerton was an abolitionist who helped John Brown at a certain time. Like, these are not, your revolutionary voices that you might want for this kind of movement. So I guess, how did his perspective, maybe a better question would be to ask from the top instead of from the bottom here. How did the gentlemen saints perceive Benjamin Lay's systemic critique? And what did Ben think about those arguments? What did he think about the social superiors, quote unquote, who were on this issue technically his allies, but on pretty much every other issue, they stand in absolute opposition to him?
Yeah. He waged a war against the corrupting power of wealth. And even wealthy people who agreed with him on the issue of slavery, and there really weren't very many of them in his day, he will become better known in the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. He just had such a comprehensive critique that people were, and see, this mattered a lot to him because he thought that wealth was destroying Quakerism too.
Right.
That he was constantly accused people of not speaking from the spirit, not speaking from the inner light, that in fact they were just speaking in ways that were self-important and materialistic and all the rest. And he thought this was just utterly destructive. So I think that one thing you can be sure of about Benjamin Lay is that he would be a very powerful critic of any kind of inequality. It didn't matter what kind. And wealth was, I think, kind of one of the biggest ones. But he believed that men and women were all equal in the sight of the Lord. He believed that animals were our fellow creatures, as he called them. So he just had this comprehensive worldview, and it really was a very strong class-based perspective.
Yes.
He really came from a poor, humble background, and he never abandoned that. See, the thing is, people would make this trade-off. I'll look the other way on slavery if it's going to help me to prosper individually.
Sure.
That's what most Quakers did in the early days. And he stood up, he said, that is wrong. You're compromising core principles. You've got to fight to maintain these genuine human values. So I think we can say that his view of the gentleman saints, he would have seen them as hypocrites.
Yeah.
That you can't, proclaim yourself to be against slavery and then enjoy all these great advantages of wealth. He thought that was another form of evil.
Yeah. Well, as you said in Freedom Ship, solidarity meant removing all shackles.
That's right. That's right. And he really saw that. He really believed it. And I think that's, So in this way, he is kind of a hero. I didn't set out to write a story of a hero, but he's someone whose views are so radical on so many different subjects. He kind of expresses some of the best hopes for humanity.
Yeah.
And that's why I've done everything I can to bring him back to public memory.
Thank you for that. And for all the other people that you've been part of bringing back to public memory. It's very easy right now to just feel defeated all the time. And it's clear too, when reading these stories, that even these people at times felt very defeated, outcast, structurally, personally, however. And it's not to say like, oh, pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing, but it is to say, look around you, find the people that you can be in solidarity with, and work together to make these changes. Because Benjamin Lay was right. He was right before most people were, and despite I guess that's kind of what I meant by lonely in a way too. Is that feeling that you're the only one in the world, who it feels that you can feel like you're the only one in the world who sees that the planet that we've built right now, the world system that we built right now, is just the wrong one. It's not great. And I guess to people who do feel like that, I can highly recommend this book. Really, most of Marcus's books, in fact. And that might be, I guess, where I want to close it today. I've been running really long episodes lately, so I'm going to try to give my listeners a bit of a break here. But Marcus, thank you so much for coming on. And we'll be posting links to your books in the show description. But is there a place that you might want to send people to keep up with you and what's going on and other projects you're working on? I mean, it's not just books for you. There's, like I've mentioned before, you've been part of the production of some graphic novels, a play. So where can we keep up with your latest?
You can visit my website, marcusrediker.com. My books are pretty widely available. They've been published in a lot of different parts of the world, I'm happy to say. So, Fritz, it's been great talking with you. I would just add one quick final comment.
Please.
Going off of what you said there at the end. If you were to ask the people who were risking their lives by escaping slavery in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, if they ever thought the system of slavery would come to an end within their lifetimes, the overwhelming majority would have said no.
Yeah.
Because this system was so powerful worldwide. And the same was true for Benjamin Lay. Did he really think he could abolish slavery? But the truth is, history from below is full of surprises.
That's right.
You just don't know when a movement is going to arise and do remarkable things. I mean, look at the Amistad Rebellion.
Yeah.
A small number of people, 53 people on the north coast of Cuba, wage a revolt to capture their ship. And inside of 3 years, the most powerful people in the world are debating what they've done.
Right. Yeah.
This ends up being a tremendous victory for the worldwide abolitionist movement. So you just never really know. So I think that's hopeful. We can take inspiration from these other stories, but we can also see that even in what would have seemed to us as very dark times, things can happen.
It's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Marcus. And I would love to try to get you back on when this Hydra text comes out and I get a chance to absorb it. But we'll play that by ear.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you very much, listeners, for joining us. And if you want to hear more stories like this one and stories about the other side of all of this, the weirdos and fascists and ruling class wackos, then please join patreon.com/thestateBetweenUs free, and we'll see you around. All right. Thank you very much, and goodbye.